With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the country of Ukraine became an independent state. Yet on Wednesday, February 23rd of 2022, Russian forces began an invasion of Ukraine. The question is why? Why did Russia invade Ukraine? To help us sort out this complex issue is our guest, Miles Hansen, President and CEO of the World Trade Center, Utah. Miles, thank you for being with us.
Garry, it's good to be on the show.
Can you start our program by giving us an idea? What is Russia's end game? What's their objective? Why have they chose this military aggression?
And Garry, before I dive into that, I think it's really important before we jump in and talk about a topic like this, Russia and Ukraine. I think it's important for all of us to remember that it's easy at times to think of foreign policy issues like this as a game of risk. We can all look at the map, and we've seen the maps online, and you see Russia, you see Ukraine, you see where planes are flying and crashing, where
Sure.
fighting is occurring. I think it's really, really important to remember that there are real people in Ukraine that are suffering immensely because of Vladimir Putin's egregious and criminal war in Ukraine.
Well said, Miles.
And we need to think about the fact that there are those individuals that their lives are being uprooted, they're being killed, they're being traumatized. A country is being absolutely demolished in front of our eyes, and it's because Vladimir Putin is very selfishly and aggressively wanting to take over a very vibrant country and a vibrant democracy. So it's important that we don't lose sight of the fact that there is a very real human angle to this.
Indeed.
Now, to the question of what are the motivations?
Yes.
Vladimir Putin for decades has lamented the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's easy for us as Americans to think back to the early 1990s, late 1980s, and to think about how excited we were at the end of the Cold War. We won. Yes. Democracy was spreading around the world. Free markets was spreading around the world. And as you think about the feelings of pride and exuberance that we felt in the West, many of the Russian people felt that ashamed. That same degree of the fact that they felt like that they lost. Not all Russians, and I believe not even a majority of Russians. I think a majority of Russians were excited about what the future would bring with greater integration with the West. But there were some Russians who viewed that as a catastrophe. They viewed that as a loss. They viewed that as a source of shame that Soviet leaders were willing to peacefully end the Soviet Union. And Vladimir Putin was one of those Russians. And so for the past 30 years, he has been working very hard to reassert Russia as a counterbalance to the United States and our partners in Europe. He is not committed to democracy. He is not committed to free market capitalism. And he wants to grow and expand Russia's influence and also Russia's borders. If you look what Vladimir Putin did in Georgia in 2008, where Russia came and annexed two parts of the country of Georgia, which is on the southern flank of Russia. In 2014, we're well aware that he came and annexed parts of Ukraine in the Crimea. And so he has been working very hard to grow and expand Russia's boundaries, Russia's influence, and to isolate, undermine, fight, do whatever he needed to do to go against those that are not on board with this expansionist view of Russia. And what we've seen in Ukraine over the past 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years is that Ukraine wants to take a different course. Ukraine wants to be integrated with Europe. Ukraine wants to be a vibrant democracy. Ukraine does not want to be subjugated to Russia. And that's a problem for somebody like Vladimir Putin. And so as a megalomaniac, is somebody who is focused on his own selfish ambitions and this drive to expand Russia, to try to reconstitute in some way the Soviet Union. What we've seen is Vladimir Putin is very willing to attack and invade Ukraine, to terrorize civilians, to try to overthrow the government, to try to subjugate Ukraine, to make it, if not officially part of Russia, then at least make sure that it's controlled by Russia.
Well, it seems that Russia is facing world opposition, condemnation, shaming, maybe even isolation from the rest of the world. Is Putin's remembrance of the old Soviet Union Federation so strong that he's just disregarding these possible impacts to his country?
I think it's really surprising that given how clear it was before Putin launched his invasion that there would be severe costs, that Putin still went ahead with the invasion.
He's willing to pay those prices.
And he's willing to pay those prices. And I think that that's really important for us to consider as we think about what the United States and Europe and our partners around the world do moving forward. I think it's really critical to recognize that the Biden administration, our partners in Europe, actually did a pretty good job of communicating the significant costs that Russia would have to bear if Putin invaded Ukraine. I think it's really important, Gary, really very briefly, that to recognize, why did Putin choose now to do this? I see a direct link between Putin's decision to do this now with the way that the absolute debacle that occurred last summer as we withdrew from Afghanistan. And it's not the withdrawal itself, but it's the way we withdrew, the way we turned and ran and demonstrated a lack of resolve and a lack of competence.
Showing weakness on our part.
That Putin saw a window of opportunity and figured that this would be his opportunity to go after Ukraine.
So that may have escalated his time.
I think that accelerated the timeline. But again, the Biden administration, our partners in Europe and around the world, did a good job leading up to the invasion of communicating these severe costs. Putin disregarded those and invaded anyways. And it's just tough, Gary, to see how this plays out in a way that is good for Russia's strategic interests.
Indeed.
Given the unified stance that the world has taken to support the Ukrainian people as they very heroically fight against the Russian invaders.
It's been reported many times that this invasion has global implications. Can you give us an idea what some of those more serious implications might be for the world at large?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to place a conflict like this in the global context to understand why the United States and Europe and our partners around the world are willing to stand up to resist and ensure that Russia faces steep penalties and costs for doing this. And for one, Gary, if you look at Europe itself, for many years, we've heard presidents from both parties here in the United States arguing that Europe needed to spend more money on its defense, had to be in a better position to secure Europe. We've seen again, bipartisan for many years, a desire to invigorate NATO. And after NATO and our allies fought with us in Afghanistan, elsewhere in the world, further away from Europe, which is where NATO was really set up to defend democracy and our values and interest in Europe, there's been a desire to get it refocused on that core mission. And yet there's been some hesitancy among some of our partners in Europe. And what we've seen in terms of a global implication is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is invigorating NATO. It's invigorating our European partners. They now are committing to spend more on their defense. They are now committing to invest in reducing their dependency on energy from Russia. There's no question that President Xi Jinping in China has been very explicit over the years that they believe that Taiwan should be a part of China.
Yes.
Because of the unified response against Vladimir Putin. I think that President Xi in China right now, as they think about their interest to take over Taiwan, are going to think twice as to whether or not they want to face the same type of united global response against some sort of aggression there. And then briefly, you look at it in terms of markets, energy markets are undoubtedly being shaped and changed. We have record high gas prices here in the United States. That's true in other countries around the world. And also commodity prices. Yes. Russia and Ukraine account for a significant percentage of global wheat exports. And so as you see a conflict reducing those, we are seeing food prices around the world increasing as well.
So what are the benefits, economic benefits to Russia?
I think I don't see economic factors playing a significant role in Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. I see it more of a matter of their security. They want to make sure that they have influence over countries that are close to Russia. I see it politically. If Vladimir Putin, if he is able to exert Russian control over Ukraine, if he were able to do that at low cost, I think that he perceives that as benefiting him domestically in Russia. I think that Russia is looking for more global clout. They want to be taken seriously around the world. They want to be a superpower. They're not. They're a regional power armed with nuclear weapons. So anyways, as you look at Ukraine, my guess is that Russia did not perceive real significant economic interests in Ukraine.
More of an expansionary
More political
philosophy,
security.
sure.
And an expansion, a pride factor of reasserting Russian dominance over Eastern Europe.
Well, with that thought in mind, is this just the beginning? If Putin is successful, if Russia successfully takes over the Ukraine, is that just the first step? Or will there be more countries that contiguous countries that face the same possible future?
You know, Gary, again, this is the third step in some ways, right? Because Russia took over parts of Georgia, took parts of Ukraine and Crimea. Now it's going for broke over all of Ukraine. You know, it's been interesting over the past few weeks. Vladimir Putin has referred a couple different times to Lithuania as a country that doesn't really exist in his view, and is kind of an artificial country, is a distinct country away from Russia itself, which is similar logic that he used leading up to the invasion of Ukraine. The other Baltic states in Estonia and Latvia, historically, at least during the Soviet times, were part of the Soviet Union, and the Baltic people suffered immensely during the Soviet rule. And so I think that if Vladimir Putin was able to go and take over Ukraine at low cost, that then he may be looking at Lithuania, the Baltic states, perhaps other territories
other
in Georgia.
Countries.
But thankfully, the war is not nearly as easy as he expected it to be.
It doesn't appear to be.
And it's absolutely critical that in the United States and Europe and with our partners around the world, that we do whatever it takes to ensure that Vladimir Putin is not able to take over Ukraine, and so that he does not have the opportunity to consolidate that win and then look further afield.
So mechanically, politically, how would this work? If Russia is successful, then I presume they would set up a puppet government that would be supportive of Putin and his philosophical approach to world domination. Is that?
I think that Afghanistan in 1979 gives a pretty good template. So for those who may not be familiar, the Soviet Union was unhappy with the government in Kabul, Afghanistan in the late 70s, and there was some changeover in governments there. They wanted to have a communist government that was very much aligned with the Soviet Union. And so in 1979, the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan and quickly overthrew the government and installed a puppet regime. But that was just the opening phase. The Afghan people rallied, fought back against the Soviet invasion, and continued to fight until the late 1980s, when the Soviet army withdrew from Afghanistan. During that period of time, the war was an absolute debacle for the Soviet Union. Was very costly in terms of blood and treasure for the Soviet people, and is viewed as being one factor in the downfall of the Soviet Union. So I think when I look at Ukraine, I think that if Putin gets his way, the Ukrainian government, the democratically elected Ukrainian government, will need to leave Ukraine, likely set up a government in exile in a neighboring country. Putin would then go to move to come up with some sort of a Russia-aligned government and administrative force to try to govern Ukraine. But I think that if he views that as being successful or effective, he will be sorely disappointed, because the Ukrainian people have demonstrated over the past few weeks
they're resolved.
They are deeply resolved
Indeed.
and committed. The Ukrainians are tough. If you go back to throughout their history, they have been incredibly tough, tons of grit, resilience. We've seen that now over the past few weeks. And so no matter whether or not their government is in exile or continuing to govern from Kyiv, the Ukrainian people are not going to allow Putin to take over their country, which then takes me back to where we started. It's hard to see how this plays out in a way that's good for Russia and their strategic interests long term. But it also means that the United States and Europe and our partners around the world need to do whatever we need to do to support the Ukrainian people, to make sure that we shore them up, that they have the food, the supplies, the weapons that they need to sustain this resistance and this defense of Ukraine against Russia, so that Vladimir Putin can never declare victory in taking over Ukraine.
You know, Putin on several interviews have made pretty chilling and threatening comments. And let me just kind of quote here. It said, "Nation looking to involve itself in the conflict against his country consequences you have never seen. Does he mean economically? Does he mean militarily? Is he thinking nuclear?
So,
how do you interpret
Garry,
this?
think about the audience, right? He's talking to a lot of European countries. We'll take Germany and France as examples. We talk about economic hardship. Germany and France have experienced those. You
Indeed.
think about, the horrors of war and destruction. Germany and France have experienced those. You would think about, chemical weapons in World War I. Germany and France, they've experienced those. The one thing they haven't experienced is nuclear war. And if you look at a week before Vladimir Putin said that, they did a test of their strategic defense, which is a nice way of saying their capability to unleash nuclear war on the world. And then a week later, he's threatening things that they've never experienced before. And again, nuclear war is the only thing that those countries have not experienced before.
Yes.
So there's no question that's a veiled threat to try to keep
more saber rattling than.
With Vladimir Putin and his decision to invade Ukraine, again, did not demonstrate good leadership, did not demonstrate good strategic foresight. He's a megalomaniac. He is going for broke in Ukraine and does not care at all about what the world thinks about him or what the death and destruction and the immorality of causing all of this for the people of Ukraine. But this is not new. If you look at what Russia did in Syria, it's absolutely atrocious. The war crimes and the death and destruction that they caused in Syria. And so this is par for the course for Vladimir Putin. But as to whether or not these are just saber-rattling bluffs, I certainly hope so.
Indeed.
I don't want to create any fear that there's anything imminent. But at the same time, I think leaders in our country and other capitals need to recognize two things. One, they have to take every threat seriously, but that does not mean to back down.
Sure.
What it means is to use that to strengthen our resolve to do whatever it takes to deny Vladimir Putin the means to wage war in any fashion. And if we need to get very aggressive about supporting the opposition in Russia to undermine the stability of the Russian regime in Russia itself, then we absolutely need to do that. Because as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge in Russia, we're not going to have a clear sense as to whether or not he's just bluffing or whether or not he has serious intent to potentially use tactical nuclear weapons to try to achieve his aims in Ukraine or elsewhere.
It's interesting to think that maybe he is not listening to his advisors, to his fellow countrymen. There appears to be some opposition to the war from within the country. Journalists, scientists, municipal council members have signed letters in opposition to the invasion. Apparently, this makes no difference to Putin at all. Is that a fair assumption?
No, I think that is a fair assumption. You have, leaders of very prominent Russian energy companies speaking out to say that the war is not a good thing. Others within Putin's inner circle, or at least tangential to the inner circle, and then also the Russian people. And I think I saw 4,000 Russians have been arrested for protesting the war. Russia is enacting a law that would make protesting the war punishable with 15 years in prison. 15 years in any prison is a hard thing, but 15 years in a Russian prison, that's a tall challenge. And that's a huge consequence, right?
Unimaginable.
And so hats off to the Russian people for standing up against this war, and they need to continue to do that. I think it's very important to draw a distinction between the anger, the rage, the frustration, the animosity with Vladimir Putin, and also still recognize the vast majority of Russian people are wonderful people that want to live their lives and do not want war. We need those people to be empowered in order to speak up, to try to put pressure on Vladimir Putin.
Indeed.
But I think that ultimately he's not listening to anybody. And I'd encourage anybody to look at some of the mock national security meetings that they held immediately prior to the invasion, where Putin's different advisors would stand up and clearly reading from a script to talk about their perspective on things. And there was one of the high-level officials in the security services that got off script a little bit, and Putin very quickly corrected him and got him back on script.
Yes.
And so that's a good indicator that there is nobody there that is willing to tell Putin that the emperor has no clothes, and that's why the rest of the world has to expose him for what he is.
Kind of switching our emphasis to the kind of the economic environment. We've heard a lot about Russian assets being frozen. What does that mean, and is it having any sort of a impact?
Yeah. So everybody in the real estate industry is very familiar with financial flows, how the banking system works. Anybody that's done any sort of business with an international partner understands foreign exchange and how currency flows operate around the world. What the United States and our partners in Europe have done over the past few weeks is to work to isolate Russia financially, to make it far more difficult for Russia and the Russian government and also the Russian economy as a whole to access global financial markets. And so by freezing assets, by restricting the ability of the Russian central bank to trade in foreign currencies, by cutting off major Russian banks from the global financial system, the intent is to make the Russian economy suffer just a small percent of the costs and the horrors that the people of Ukraine are suffering as an act of deterrence, to try to inflict cost to Vladimir Putin, and also to try to undermine the strength of the Russian economy, which then plays into Russia's ability to inflict war on Ukraine. And it absolutely is working. The ruble has absolutely collapsed.
Yes, 1 cent to $1 as I last looked.
Yeah, and in fact, I think it's even fallen even further. I think 140 ruble to the dollar. Before I think it was 40 to 50 to 60 or so. And so we've seen the ruble collapse. We've seen Russian stocks, companies that are listed in foreign markets have crashed. We've seen many countries freezing the assets of prominent Russians and oligarchs, many of whom are close to Vladimir Putin, so that those people can't access their wealth any longer. We've seen many companies across Europe and the United States divesting from Russia. I think that's driven by two factors. One, a desire to stand up, to say, no, this is not right. We want to stand in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. Mm-hmm. Like another factor is these companies just don't want to deal with the hassle of trying to get money in and out of Russia anymore. And it's become much more difficult to do business there. And so these sanctions have been put in place are biting. And I'm encouraged by what was announced just today, in fact, that the United States is no longer going to import Russian oil. And we're working very closely with our partners around the world to try to alleviate the dependency of Europe on Russian energy, to enable us to then help undercut Russia's ability to finance this war through energy exports.
Well, I've read that also, and I guess that seems like a logical step, but we're a buyer, a pretty big consumer of Russian oil and gas. Is that going to translate into higher fuel pump prices, higher airline tickets, et cetera, for the United States?
Garry, here in the United States, we're actually a very minor buyer of Russian oil here in the United States. We're a net exporter of energy, and we're integrated with global energy markets, so we're both exporting and importing. But for us, it's relatively easier to take this step than our partners in Europe because it's a relatively smaller percentage. But oil price or gas prices were increasing before this war began.
They were indeed. Yes.
And there's a lot of factors for why that's occurring. This, no question, is having a significant being a significant driver of increased gas prices here in the United States. So yes, Americans should expect to pay more at the pump because we're standing up to Vladimir Putin saying we're not going to buy any more of your oil, so you can use that money to go and devastate Ukraine. Sure. The bigger challenge is helping our European partners do the same. They are far more dependent on Russian energy, both oil and gas, and natural gas. And so they have a harder time going ahead and immediately banning these energy imports. I wish that they had worked hard over the past 5 or 6 or 7 years to diversify away from Russia, to install, to build liquid natural gas import terminals that would allow them to buy, liquid natural gas off the spot market from anywhere in the world. But they didn't. They invested in more Germany in particular invested in more pipelines from Russia.
So now,
which means that they're feeling the pain even more than we are here. But it's absolutely critical in the months and years ahead that Europe works very aggressively to wean itself off of Russian energy. And in the short term, the United States can play a very important role in providing liquid natural gas and oil and gas and other products, either from ourselves or with our partners and allies around the world, to Europe, so that Europe can act aggressively in cutting off their imports of Russian energy.
our country has faced the highest inflation levels, over 7%, in some 40 years. Do we face a serious risk of increased inflation because of this turmoil in the country?
There are lots of different factors for why inflation's been so high. Least of which is the record government spending that we saw during the pandemic. We added significant amounts of debt and a massive infusion
Indeed, we did.
of money into our economy, and that so. No question that when you spend trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars on stimulus and supporting the economy, that we're going to see increased prices. And so that will continue to be the most significant driving factor of inflation. But this war in Russia and Ukraine absolutely has an inflationary pressure on our economy as well. We know that energy is a big piece of inflation. So is food. Housing, of course, is something that this audience knows very well. But all those things are continuing to point towards a period of higher inflation here in the United States.
What about supply chain issues? Will we continue to see, will the situation in Europe negatively impact the supply chain issues?
This is one, Gary, that thankfully, Russia and Ukraine are not key nodes in the global supply chain network. We've been experiencing a global supply chain crisis now for more than a year, and there are a lot of factors for why that's occurring. Relatively few of them are closely tied to what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. I think the biggest factor would be the increased energy prices, particularly if there's movement around the world to isolate and ban the sale of Russian oil and gas. That would lead to higher energy costs, higher shipping costs, and that would
Indeed.
have a material impact on global supply chains. If the war spread elsewhere in Europe, then it could have a very significant impact on global supply chains. But as it stands between Russia and Ukraine, aside from the cost of energy and fuel, I don't see real significant impacts for supply chains around the world.
What other products do you see that could be seriously impacted, that either price increases or shortages? Any specific products?
So we've talked about commodity prices and food.
Yeah.
And you take wheat as an example. With all of the wheat that Russia and Ukraine are exporting, that then goes off the table, and that becomes challenging from a food security and a food price perspective. Here in the United States, we would experience that less just because we produce so much wheat and so much of these food commodities here. And so less of a concern in the United States. But in countries that are importing wheat from Russia and Ukraine, lots of concern. In Africa and the Middle East, parts of Europe as well, those are areas that will be impacted by the increase of food commodities. And then as they're producing things, that can spread to other parts of the world. Another area that I think is really important to point out is in different types of metals. So platinum and titanium and nickel, lithium, those are produced in great abundance in Russia and also to some extent in Ukraine as well. And so as Russia gets isolated economically, as it becomes far more difficult for investment into Russia and for financial flows in and out of Russia, that's going to have an impact on Russia's ability to export these metals, which are very important in all sorts of different manufacturing industries.
Well, oil is used in the production of at least 6,000 products, and certainly in the production of many, if not all, agricultural products. So it's probably safe to assume some price increases in the foreseeable future because of this issue. Well, we only have a couple of minutes left, Miles. Global question.
Yeah.
Can you estimate the impact on the world financial markets?
That's a good question. And for anybody who's got a little retirement or money invested in the stock market here in the United States, right? This is the 64,000, I guess the 64 million or $1 billion question,
that's
right?
Yes.
I think it's really hard to say. I left my crystal ball at home.
Yet to be determined.
That's exactly right. Yet to be determined. But what I do think is that this unquestionably creates more uncertainty in markets.
And markets do not like uncertainty.
That's exactly right. Capital is a coward.
Yes.
And so what we see is with uncertainty, you have a lot of people that say, yeah, I don't know for sure how this is going to impact things. And that uncertainty alone creates a desire to keep capital on the sidelines. And that can then tampen down economic growth and expansion and success in markets. And so as the uncertainty persists, I think we're going to see volatility in markets and a lot of people trying to figure out which way are things going to go. And you add that with inflation and supply chain challenges, longer lasting impacts as we come out of the pandemic. What happens as the government can't continue to sustain this type of spending long term, and what does it mean for our long-term debt? And you put all that together, and it creates
enough. You have a complicated question.
You've got a complicated question.
Indeed, with no easy solution.
That's exactly right.
Indeed. Well, one final question in closing. Will the countries of the world find some way at some point of punishing Putin and Russia for this?
I think that what we've seen is a strong desire and resolve from countries around the world to punish Putin, to punish the Russian government, Russia's economy. I think that the key question is, how much are we willing to continue to ratchet up the pressure as Vladimir Putin undoubtedly continues to wage a devastating war in Ukraine? Are we willing to, get more aggressive about providing Ukrainians with all of the arms and support that they need to defend their country, including, fighter jets, providing them the ability to restock, to refuel, to resupply in other countries before we're going back into Ukraine? Are we going to be willing to say if Russia is using weapon systems against the Ukrainian people, are we willing to provide the same weapon systems to the Ukrainians so they can fight back to defend their country and also attack the military bases and things in Russia itself that are vital to Russia to be able to wage the war? Are we willing to put energy on the table, and for Europe and the rest of the world that are large consumers of Russian energy, to get them to ban Russian imports and bear some cost as Europeans and as Americans to stand up in solidarity for the Ukrainian people and for democracy and against this egregious war of aggression that Putin is waging? And my hope is, my expectation is that the world is going to stand up and say, yes, we are willing to stand up. We are willing to fight through these different various means in order to ensure that Vladimir Putin never has the opportunity to declare victory in Ukraine.
Miles, thank you very much. We greatly appreciate your insights and your time today. That concludes this episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge. Today's program was brought to you by Stringham Schools, educating real estate professionals since 1989. Visit stringhamschools.com to learn more. We want to thank today's guests, and don't forget to tell us what you think in the comments section below. I'm Garry Barnes, and I'll see you on the next episode of Stringham Real Estate Edge.